Thank you very much. One of the great advantages of modern technology is that you can give a lecture in the dark so that you can't read your notes. But you have a lovely picture in front of you. I put it there without apology. It comes from the first room in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. I spoke to the Eden Conference 4 years ago when I was the Director of Education in the European Commission, and I was just about to go off for a sabbatical year in Florence. And if you do that, you can, for 60 euros, you can become a friend of the Uffizi Gallery. You can go in there every day. You bypass the 2.5-hour queue of tourists, and you can spend half an hour looking at pictures like that and thinking how wonderful it is to get there. I had these in my presentation, and I took them out last night. I'm a constant fiddler. But I met a charming lady as I was coming down the street, and we got talking about Florence, and she said, "Oh, put them in." So I've put them in just to satisfy the audience. But what I want to say, just building from these lovely pictures, is that you're probably not able to get there to appreciate this in one. I got there at the end of a career, not at the beginning. And as we know, education is something that starts at the cradle and goes on to the grave. It really does. As I was getting on the plane to come down here the other morning, two people, as often happens on planes, were having a debate about who should go on the window side and who should go on the aisle side. And so everyone was backed up behind them, waiting patiently. And on my left, there was a young couple, and the husband was holding a little baby on his lap. The baby was 8 or 9 months old. I'm quite good at the age of babies at the moment, and was sort of standing the way they do and was looking with big eyes. And I was just thinking, you are seeing confusing images that you can't understand, and you're in the process of learning to adjust them and relate to them and get the signs that enable you to give meaning. And so learning starts, we all know it starts, right at the very beginning of life. A year ago, my mother died in her 100th year. I'm very proud of her. And on the day she died, she was doing the crossword and working and learning. Learning goes on from the moment of our birth right through to our death. The question is not whether learning is lifelong, it's whether the education system supports that learning as a lifelong process. And I have an opportunity here to talk about things that are fascinating to me. Have I told you about my grandchildren? Well, here is Joey, and Joey is experiencing colour for the first time. He's looking a little bit diffident, and it's confusing and a bit awe-inspiring, but he's trying, just like the little baby on the plane, to put some order, some structure into confusing things. And he will make dabs of colour, and he will make shapes, and he learns to make circles and so on, and he'll get hold of the signs and what they mean and how you put them together and how you simplify reality in order to reveal it. If he does, he may learn to play a game, which I think I played as a child, but you can find it it's good to give credit for it, you can find it in Ernest Gombrich's Art and Illusion. But I think that he picked it from children. I think it's a common game. You may know it. What is this? This is a ball. Right? Very easy to understand. This is an art class. And now it's become a bag. You see the handle. And if you adapt it a little bit more, I'm not just so convinced by the next image, but if you adapt it just a little, it becomes a purse. This is one of those purses that opens like that with 2 little latches. And if you adapt it just a little bit more, it becomes a cat. And it's a cat that's quite interesting because the cat is sitting the way cats do, looking away from us, and it looks a rather smug and self-satisfied cat. So it has character. And it's amazing what we have got out of a number of very simple signs. Now, if the signs are unrelated, you simply have a circle and an arc of a circle. Because I'm not very adept with my computer, I couldn't produce that, and a couple of little triangles and a squiggle. And you put them together and you get meaning. And the funny thing is that when you put them together, depending on which ones you put together, you get different meanings. Now, this is something that you can give a lot of thought to, and it helps with understanding about the way we put information together and what it does. I come back to my grandchildren because I really find them extremely interesting, and give you another image. And here is Holly watching The Greatest Show on Earth. And she is seeing a kaleidoscope of colours that are moving, and she's hearing clicks and buzzes and then whirs, and then there's vibration as the whole thing shakes. And it's fascinating. What on earth does it mean? What does she make of it? Well, to help her, I want to bring in someone whose work I spent some time studying while I was in Florence. I had a year in Florence, and I managed to learn some Italian, which was a good thing to do, and I managed to read Dante, which was a very good thing to do, and I went to the Uffizi Gallery and all the other galleries, and that was a very good thing to do. But I also did something quite serious. By accident, I pulled a book off a shelf one day by an author that I'd heard of, and read a couple of pages and thought, that's very interesting. I'm going to give myself 2 weeks to read that, and I spent the next 6 months trying to read it, and I learned a lot, but I'm just getting there. It's about Paul Ricoeur. Now, Paul Ricoeur is a French philosopher, was a French philosopher. He died about 5 years ago. You can see from his picture that he's done a lot of thinking, and that's why he has that worried look on his face. But he has shown, he has taught us a lot about understanding what we have in front of us. When I was Director of Education, I was involved in a committee of European vice-chancellors. And these were engineers and scientists and all that sort of thing. And there was a chap from the University of Zurich who chaired the group. And his name was Hans Vader. Some of you may know him. And he turned out to be a theologian. And he was an expert in hermeneutics. And someone said, well, how on earth do you sit and mix with particle physicists and things like that? And he said the subject is highly related. Hermeneutics is all about how you interpret the data that confronts you. Just the problem that Holly was facing as she looks at the washing machine. What on earth is all this confusion of colour and feeling and sound? What does it mean? Well, I'm going to give you a course in what I learned from Paul Ricoeur very quickly, and you can do the hard one another time. He talks first about the need for creative imitation. Now, he gets this from Aristotle. Aristotle uses Greek, and the word is mimesis. By creative imitation, you simplify the complexity of life, and you use that simplification in order to reveal more. And if you go back to those pictures that I put up at the start, that's why I was originally thinking about them, they show great images, Madonna and Child. They're some of the greatest pictures in the world. They've been around for 700 years and admired throughout that time. And one is deluded easily into thinking that this is the Madonna and Child, but this is not the Madonna and Child. This is a board with dabs of paint on it, done by 3 different artists, and it creates in us the illusion that we're looking at the Madonna and Child, and we see things in it, and the 3 pictures which were done within 20 years of each other by Cimabue and Duccio and Giotto managed to bring out rather different messages from the same background. Well, I decided to leave that to one side, so I won't talk about it. And Paul Ricoeur looks much more at text than at pictures. And he starts by talking about symbols. And there are many symbols in text. I don't want to stay with symbols for very long, but I'll mention one later on. Symbols are things that have a primary meaning. We can see what the primary meaning is. But we feel sure that there is a secondary meaning, that they point to something beyond themselves. And Ricoeur constantly says the attraction and the value of the symbol is that it inspires thought. It makes us ask, what's it pointing to? What's beyond? And there is no definite answer. What it points to is what you find. Then he goes on to talk a lot about metaphor. And as well as having been Director of Education Policy, I was for several years Director of Innovation Policy, and I was very interested in the whole business of creativity. And Ricoeur, this is why I started reading Ricoeur in the first place, Ricoeur believes that metaphor is what gives rise to creativity. Now, a metaphor, we all know what metaphors are, but just to refresh your mind, my wife is with me, but she's not here today, and I could speak about my wife and say, as I said to somebody in Brussels recently, oh, Diana is a peach. Now, there's a metaphor. It says something about Diana. It says she's a peach. Now, the first thing that you notice in that, and it's characteristic of every metaphor, is that it's false. Diana is not a peach. She is a human being, and a peach is a fruit that grows on a tree. And so the person hearing the metaphor is confronted by something false and is driven to ask, well, if it doesn't mean what it appears to mean, what could it mean? And so you start thinking about the characteristics of a peach and whether you can transfer them to Diana. And so you might say, well, a peach has a rosy complexion, like Diana. A peach is sweet to eat, like Diana. A peach is very attractive to hold, like Diana. And so you can go on, depending on your experience of peaches. Now, if your experience of peaches is different from what I've just alluded to, you might come out with different things. You might say, be careful when you bite a peach because you might break your teeth on the stone. Or you might say, a few years ago, this gives away my age group, but 30 years ago, we discovered avocados and thought they were wonderful. And I mentioned to my mother when I was at home, avocados, wonderful. She said, oh, I had one once. It was tasteless and hard. I don't like avocados. Depends on what your experience is. If your experience of peaches is that they're unripe and hard and sour, then that metaphor maybe inspires that thought. Now, what I want to say about the metaphor here is, I said the metaphor, it's the person who hears the metaphor who gives it meaning. And there is an almost endless capacity to give new meanings from the hearer, depending on what the hearer's experience has been. And the meaning of the metaphor is a combination of what the utterer said and what the hearer attributes to it. And the curious characteristic is, having once said the metaphor, Diana is a peach, I cannot transform the results of that metaphor back into unambiguous descriptive language without risking losing some of the meaning that the metaphor has acquired. The metaphor gives rise to a surplus of meaning which opens up new vistas of knowledge. And Ricoeur argues, and given I've thought about it a lot for the last 3 years, he argues that that in fact is the source of all creativity. Well, he may well be right. It's certainly a serious thought. He points out that scientific theories have the character of metaphor. I'll move on. I say it, you interpret it, it has a surplus of meaning, it can't be translated back. Ricoeur then goes on to talk about narrative. And with narrative, the way we tell stories, we configure reality. the plot asserts cause. If I take a simple set of facts, there was a young prince, unmarried. He married a beautiful princess. A few years later, the prince died, and after that, the princess died. You can tell a story across that. Once upon a time, there was a young prince, a handsome young man, who hadn't found a wife, but he met and fell in love with a beautiful, glamorous princess, and they were divinely happy until one day, in a terrible riding accident, the young prince fell to his death, and the princess had a broken heart, and shortly after she died. There's a telling of the story. And it conforms to the facts, but I can tell another story with the same facts. Once upon a time, there was a prince. He was the son of a king and queen. He had to get married, because princes do. And his parents found a princess and said, "You're going to marry," which they did because they had to. He spent his life on the pleasures of hunting while she stayed at home. They had no life as a couple whatsoever. One day, as everyone had said would happen, he broke his neck while out galloping after deer. She, meanwhile, had been serious, and she had been governing the country. And she made enemies among the barons who didn't like having someone who was firmly in control, and a few years later they managed to murder her. Same facts, entirely different story. The way you tell the story around the facts asserts cause and connection between the different facts and configures reality. And there's an infinite number of ways that you can tell stories, provided also, always, that you retain the facts that are there. When we tell historical stories, we configure the past in order to tell us why things are now as they are, or another way of saying the same thing, how they have come to be what they are now. When we tell fictional stories, we're doing something equally useful and equally valuable, which is to present a picture not of the world as it is, but of the world as it might be, and to invite the hearer to buy into that picture and say, "I want to bring that into being." Now, this has a very interesting consequence, which is that when politicians talk, they're presenting pictures of the future. And so you can say, and I had the pleasure of saying it to a number of politicians at a conference, politicians always talk fiction. It's because that's what their job is. They're talking about how the world might be. Understanding is not in the text, and it's not in the reader of the text. It's somewhere between them. Now, postmodern interpretation often says the text means whatever the reader finds in it, and Ricoeur would say that is rubbish. The text can mean certain things, and what meaning is found depends on who reads it. But you can't find just anything there. It has to be consistent with what the text actually says. Well, all this is extremely interesting, and it leads on into how we might read and to the understanding of the hermeneutic circle. When we read a text for the first time, says Ricoeur, we get a naive understanding, but we need to go through a number of stages to deepen our understanding. In the first stage, we look at the internal coherence of the text. We look at its grammar and what the words mean, and so on. We look behind them. Then we should look at them with suspicion. Taught by Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, we ask, do the signs mean what they appear to mean? And as we do that, we move on to a deeper understanding, and we start to see the world that the text is projecting. And as we do that, we begin to get a picture emerging in front of us, and we say, I can see that world. I can see myself in that world. I want to bring that world into being. And this is an experience of reading that I'm quite certain everyone in this room has experienced at some time or another. My eldest daughter, when she was about 12, read a series of books which I've never read because they were for little girls, Anne of Green Gables. Some of you will know them, I think American books. And they were very captivating. And one day she said to her mother, "Mom, I wish I was Anne of Green Gables." Now we know that experience. That's the moment of appropriation of information, of seeing yourself in the world of the text and wanting to bring it into being. What the text means depends partly, at least, on who reads it. Well, Holly, did you get that? I think I understand. Now, what I want to do at this point is to take something else I'm working on and bring Paul Ricoeur and bring you together with that and see if there's anything we could say about distance learning. I'm now a student of theology. Well, what does theology have to say about distance learning? Well, theology says a lot about the New Testament. And the New Testament is rather interesting. What would happen if you were to read the New Testament as a distance learner? Well, that's a thing that Ricoeur would be very interested in. Would you find anything interesting there? Well, you would find that there's a very rich fund of stories and metaphors and symbols. And there are stories, metaphors, and symbols that have been told and retold over the centuries. And therefore, by the nature of things, because they've survived, they have rather deep meaning. And you can often extract far more than you think you can from them. And Ricoeur would say that one of the necessary steps to finding interesting things in there is that you have to achieve something he calls distanciation. It's a complicated word. It really means that you need to set aside your belief system, what you already know, and read the text afresh from your position as an educator. It's not always easy to do. Let the text speak for itself. Don't impose on it what you already think it means. And texts that you've come across before, it can be difficult to do that. But it's worth trying for this reason. I go back to my role in innovation. One of the things that is well established about innovation is that innovation happens not in the core areas of knowledge fields, but on the interfaces between different knowledge fields. So if you bring two knowledge fields into contact with each other, it's on the interface that you find new insight. Now that's just like the metaphor. It's bringing two apparently unrelated fields together, and when they come together, you find new things. And it may be worth having a go with our education question and the New Testament. First thing you will find if you look at the New Testament as an educator is that there are 128 references to teachers and teaching and 43 references to learning. And this, of course, is hardly surprising. The New Testament is about teaching. And I stop to say that in a conference like this, where we're all on about the new things we've discovered, it's often interesting to stop and think about the things that have been known for 2,000 years and are still thought by many to be worth reading again. You may find something in there that's quite profound. One thing you will certainly find is that all the teaching in the New Testament is relational and it's student-centered. It's all about what the person on the end of the teaching wants and needs. There are, of course, two very famous teachers in the New Testament. One of them is Jesus, the other is Paul. But the whole New Testament mediates those people to us, and the text itself is an educational instrument. If you read the New Testament to find out about education, you should expect to look for principles rather than technical solutions. I don't suppose you'll find the solutions to ICT. You might find them to distance learning. You need to be careful what I say. Now, the teaching style in the New Testament, it uses many forms and many genres, metaphor, stories. Most famously, it uses parables. It uses principles. There is a lot of exhortation. There is poetry. There is action. There are letters. It's relational and interactive. Jesus and Paul managed to pull crowds, so they must have something good about what they're doing. There is actually one teacher of the traditional style who gets mentioned in the New Testament. He's only mentioned in passing. His name is Tyrannus. Paul rents a lecture room from him. His name means what it seems to mean. It means that he was a tyrant. And maybe it gives you a picture of the traditional teacher as against the New Testament teacher. The New Testament is full of symbols and of metaphors. I'll give you one example because I think it's very well known, but it's very powerful, and you may never even have noticed that it is a metaphor. But first, it's a symbol. The light shines in darkness. Now, we read that, and it's self-evident what it means. The light shines in darkness. Nothing difficult. But we read it and we think, yes, but it means more than it appears to say. It's thinking about more than just turning on a light in a dark room. There's the symbol. And we start thinking about what it might mean. And then we read to the end of the sentence and we get more. The darkness has not overcome it. And there's something funny in there because darkness doesn't normally overcome light. Darkness is not a thing, it's an absence. Darkness overcoming light is a metaphor. And it's a rather deep one. And we start thinking, what could this mean? Light shining in darkness, the darkness can't overcome it. And you can go away and think about that and keep finding new meanings in it. And you can apply them to distance learning and to everything that you want to apply. It's an example of the rich metaphors that are there. When I became interested in metaphor, my first problem was to notice them. We learned at school in poetry about metaphor. But there is far, far more metaphor around than you think. And I thought, well, I can start to find them. I begin to notice them. Now they're jumping off the page at me. I see them all the time. And then I thought, well, I never use metaphors. And then I started to notice that I did. When you go to the garage and you can't think of the word for something, you use a metaphor. Metaphors are fundamental to language. It's the way we build language. And then I found a piece of research that had been done in America. It's typical of academic research. I know who I'm talking to. It's the sort of thing that brings fascinating results, but must have been excruciatingly boring to do. They monitored what people said by tape recording them and writing it all down and analyzing them. And it came up with the insight that ordinary people utter, on average, 3,000 metaphors, 3,000 original metaphors in a week. In other words, it's a daily, continuous pattern of conversation. Now, I would not have believed that. That's why they're so important in our language. The extended metaphor is a standard teaching method in the New Testament. And of course, it's famous. It's so famous that we've forgotten how original it is. Jesus tells stories that are known as parables. Often in response to a question, he doesn't give the answer, he tells a story. And the story invites the listener to furnish the answer. And the stories were often so good that people are still finding new answers coming out of those stories 2,000 years later, which is a pretty good way to teach. A sower went out to sow. Many of you know the story very well. The sower goes out scattering seed. Some of the seed falls on the pathway where there's no depth of soil. It germinates but quickly dies. Some of it falls in bad ground and it springs up and starts to grow, but as the sun beats down on it, its roots dry out and it dies too. Some of it falls among thorns and the thorns crush the life out of it. But other seed falls on good ground and it grows and it flourishes and it yields a crop 100-fold, vast surplus. What does it mean? Now, the fatal thing for me to do at this point is to tell you what it means, because it's asking you what it means. What would it mean to a distance learner? Now, I break my own principle, and I suggest one possible meaning that it might have for someone in distance learning, which is that you scatter enormous amounts of effort around and you see failure left, right, and center. But when it works, oh, the results are huge, and it makes all the waste worthwhile. And so it becomes a story of encouragement. If one was to see this read by a student, we might talk about how many courses disappoint, how many courses are a waste of time, what a loss of effort, but then 1 in 10 of them is brilliant. And it was worth all that trouble in order to pick up the one that paid off. The New Testament talks about teaching people where they are. Here's another metaphor for you. Another famous one, although you may not recognize the words in quotations. You find this at the beginning of John's Gospel. It talks about the picture is of people who are on the move. So nomadic people wandering in the desert with their camp and somebody coming and pitching their tent in the camp. It's a picture of identifying with people. Now there's a picture for the educator. If you want to reach people in education, maybe that's the picture you need. Identifying, putting your tent in their camp. The words that you might be more familiar with are, he dwelt among us. But if you go into the etymology of it in Greek, it means he put his tent in their camp. The teaching of the New Testament is done in homes. It's done in social gatherings. It's done with the socially excluded, famously. And it involves going to the other side. I want to take a pair of stories that are well known from the New Testament and just say something about them. I was researching in them for other reasons. I'm interested in management, and I was looking at the management insights you might get here. But the two stories are side by side, they're well known, and they're marked off by a literary device called an inclusio, which shows that they were intended to be read together. They're the well-known story of crossing the lake in a storm and the encounter with a madman in the region of Gadara, who is described as a man with demons. The story is told 3 times in the New Testament, in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you examine the stories very carefully, you'll find that except for the very few words uttered by Jesus, every other word is different between the different accounts. I was astonished. When you read them, you think this is the same. But in fact, every word is changed. And yet, if you break the story down into its constituent parts, you find the same steps, 18 steps in each story, and in the same order except for 2 that have been reversed. And what that reminds us is what I was talking about earlier. You can tell stories in an infinite number of different ways as long as you hold to your basic facts. Now, the story of the storm on the lake is not so relevant, I think, for educators, but I pick a point out of it. It's this. It's about facing trouble and danger to do the job. Jesus and his disciples get into a boat. Jesus says, we want to go to the other side. The other side, what is that? It's where the need is. It's far away. It's going away from where we are to over there. And this journey in the boat, you can understand as figurative. It's the journey that will always take place when we go to the other side. And the educator goes to the other side to meet the person who needs his services or her services. The story is told with echoes of another biblical story, the story of Jonah. This is a story about going to the other side. Jonah's story was one about running away. Curiously, it also has echoes of a story of Julius Caesar, which was probably well known at the time. Julius Caesar, the great hero, the man of phenomenal courage, who set out on a journey but turned back because of a storm. And the story asks a question. The story has an account of the calming of the storm. It goes from a great storm to a great calm. And the disciples don't say, how did he do that? They say, who is this? And we tend to misread the story by asking the question, how, when we should be asking the question, who? Well, I move on quickly to the other part of the story because it has lots of other things in it at the other side. You immediately meet a man with demons. Now, we don't believe in demons anymore. However, I would want to say this to you, that I dealt with people in the office who were very disruptive and difficult. Not many of them. I had a lot of very talented people work for me. But there were one or two out of the 500 or so who worked for me at one time or another who gave me great grief. And I would talk with my personnel assistant about so-and-so's demons. It's a metaphor. Now, it's quite a good metaphor. I could, of course, have talked about their neuroses or their bipolar disorder or their schizophrenia. Those are metaphors as well, and I find the demons one. For my purposes, given that I couldn't make there was nothing I could do directly to heal that problem, it was quite a useful one. And what you find in the story is that the man with demons lives among tombs. He prefers living among the dead rather than living among the living. It's a strange situation to be. His world is upside down. Jesus acts on him, and he does something. This is worth thinking about. You take away nothing else from what I'm saying. Take this one home with you. Jesus is confronted with this man, and he immediately makes the distinction between the man and the demons. Now, that is one of the hardest things to do when you're dealing with a troublemaker. We used to have little storylines given to us in management classes about go for the ball, don't go for the player. It's coming back to the same thing. Distinguish the demon from the man or from the woman. And Jesus does it. Worth thinking about. And we get a picture of the trouble that you get with demons in one man. Totally disruptive person. But the demons are driven out of the man and they go into a herd of pigs. And the herd of pigs then demonstrates to us how much worse it is when the demons get into a crowd. They gallop down the slope and destroy themselves. Utterly destructive. And it's become proverbial, the Gadarene swine, of course. There's a political subtext in the story. Jesus asks the demons, what's your name? And they say, Legion, because we're many. And you say, what does that mean? And then pigs are sent to their destruction. If you look at the background, you'll find that the Roman 10th Legion was based nearby. And what was their insignia? It was a pig. Maybe there's a story being told here which is anti-Roman, but it's carefully coded. And the man is pleased because his world is turned the right way up again. But funny thing happens. The townsfolk come out and they're displeased. They preferred things as they were. Food for thought. If education just endorses the status quo, we have a long way to go, said Bob Fryer yesterday. There's a tension throughout the New Testament between two types of social critique. One says we have to build from where we are. We've accumulated things of value, build them up, reinforce them, develop them, fulfill them. Another line says you break in and you turn it over. And they're both there, and the two are in tension all the time. And when they're not in tension, you're not being true to that subtext. It's giving you a method. You must always have the two there. You can think of famous phrases from the New Testament about, you have taken down the mighty from the seats, you have exalted those who are of low degree. You think about the Beatitudes. It's all about turning the world upside down. It's a method, not an answer. I must draw to a close. Paul starts distance learning. He travels to lay foundations. He lectures and he debates. We're told that he could be long-winded. Once he was still going at midnight, and a chap who was sitting on the windowsill fell asleep and fell off outside and was killed. But Paul kept going until morning. Sometimes we're told he could be hard to understand, and we might agree. But if you read him, you can find he's also lyrical at times. He wrote letters. And in the letters he was quite clever because he could take things that weren't written by him, that were already familiar, and adapt them for his own use and feed them back to people. He could use metaphors that crossed cultural barriers. He was a Jew. He was among Greeks. He picked up athletics, a big subject of interest to the Greeks. Paul built an organization so that distance learning would carry on. He placed key leaders and managers in it. If you look at the last chapter of the letter to the Romans, you'll find 20 names. What's Paul doing? He's recommending people to Rome to place them into key management slots. He sent colleagues to run tutorials. Learning is relational. Theology is about relationships. It's about where we stand in the world and how we relate to other people. And it can only be learned in community. It needs someone beside the learner to exhort them, to guide them, to encourage and accompany them. The Greek word para means beside. Kletos means called in. But together the two means someone that exhorts and guides and encourages and accompanies you. And it gives us the English word paraclete. And the English word paraclete has to do with Pentecost, the time that has just been celebrated. And it's a traditional Jewish festival that celebrated gifts to Israel. And what happens in the New Testament is that on the day of Pentecost, the vision is changed from celebrating what we've got to celebrating what other people need. And that provides us with a motto that we could use for distance learning. There it is. And you're all educated people, so you'll know that it says, Humin tois makran kaitos engus. And what it means is to those far off and to those who are near. There's an amazing amount about distance learning in the New Testament. It's worth thinking about. Thank you.